Audio file? Just the
No,
mic is fine?
it'll just upload into the cloud as soon as we're
cool.
done. So once we sign off, before you totally exit, we'll just make sure all those files upload. It should only take a minute.
Bueno.
And I don't know if you've ever listened to the show, but the way it works is I tell a narrated story about some important ascent. And I sound design the story and I make the music for the stories. And then I talk to somebody who was inspired by that climber, that ascent or whatever.
Cool. Though in this case, are you going to talk to Peter?
I'm not going to talk to Peter for I'll probably reach out to him to get some details, but I sort of like telling the stories without the people that I'm talking about.
That's an interesting approach.
So that I can blow the story up larger than life and
totally,
make it this exciting thing without everyone trying to downplay their stories.
Yeah, without Peter being like, yeah, it was a mellow day of climbing. We had a great time.
Yeah. And then what I've been doing is so I started with the 90s. So I would tell a story about Ben Moon. Well, now I'm doing the 80s. So when I tell a story about Jerry Moffat, I'm going to try to get Ben Moon on to talk about Jerry.
Have fun.
And so I'm going to try to get people on that I've talked about and told stories about to talk about who they were inspired by. So
cool.
Yeah, just try to, celebrate people and throw flowers their way.
Yeah.
and people have a hard time accepting that in person. So I'm going to tell these big stories that they can, everybody can just listen to. So your interview will follow the, Bachar and Croft doing Half Dome and El Cap in a day. And there'll certainly be more to that story, leading up to it, more of their accomplishments, how they came together. And then when they did this day. So yeah, we're just going to jump in here. And then when your episode comes out, I'll tell a super short story that I'll also sound design about you to lead into your episode, your interview. It'll be a 2-minute long story. So,
okay.
All right. You good to go?
Yeah. Lead the way.
All right. Look like we're good on this end. All right. Alex, welcome to Written in Stone.
That's so great. Written in stone.
It actually took us, we debated a bunch of different titles for a while. And that one, once it popped up, everybody was like, oh yeah, that's the one.
When it's cool because when you finish telling all the great stories about rock climbing, you can pivot towards biblical stories. And you're like, just straight Old Testament lore.
Absolutely. I'm curious about something. When I was sort of preparing for this, I wondered, are you the kind of person who gets nervous, meeting your heroes?
I used to be, for sure. Yeah, a little bit. Probably not as much anymore because now I've had a lot of experience with that, so I've gotten used to it. But no, I do remember the first time I met Peter Croft, and actually the first time I met Peter Croft, I think he was the first real life climbing hero that I'd ever met. We're both from Northern California, or both living there at the time, and so he was the first real life climbing icon I ever met, and I was like, oh my God, that's the Peter Croft. And he was climbing with this guy, Marty Lewis, who'd written the guidebook for that area. So he was also sort of like a local hero in my mind. And seeing the two of them climbing together, I was like, they felt unapproachable. I was like, look at these two gods climbing. It turns out they're both super nice, super chill. But no, I totally remember the first time I met them.
Did you go over and talk to them? Did they say hello to you? Or did you just watch from a distance and slink away?
I think I'd seen them climbing in the gorge a bit and had always just watched from a distance and slinked away. Yeah. And then I remember that when I actually met them, I needed a partner basically. And I specifically approached them because I needed a belay on something I wanted to do. I think I'd been soloing. I'd been climbing by myself in the gorge but wanted to send my sport project and was kind of like, oh, I need someone to catch. And they were in the right area. So I overcame my fear and approached them to ask about climbing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I used to, back when I was learning to climb and first going to the valley, to Zion, to these places, it was at a time when you had to pay money if you didn't want your phone number to be in the phone book, in the white pages. So climbers were never willing to pay money. So I could just get in the phone book and find Ron Kalk and John Middendorf and all these names. So I would just get in the phone book and call these people hey, I would love to talk to you about Yosemite or whatever. And I talked to Ron Kalk on the phone that way, and then happened to see him in Vitavu and just walked over to him like, hey, do you want to go bouldering tomorrow? And
Dude, that's so funny. But that shows a fundamental difference in personality between us. Because I was like mortified to talk to strangers.
well, the first time I met Bachar, and it wasn't really that I met him, it was that I saw him and we had an interesting interaction, was at an OR show. I was performing and I'm rapping. There's this big crowd around and I see this cute girl over here and I'm like, okay, I'm going to direct all my like best lines toward her, and I look toward her and John Backer's standing next to her and he's stone faced, like does not look like he's enjoying it at all. And I was like, oh no, like got super self-conscious. I'm like, okay, my mission now is to make Backer grin, So finally, I think the last song was 99 Problems, and he finally grins and I'm like, yes, I did it, And then when the show was over, I'm talking to people and Backer's disappeared. But the girl comes over and she's like, hey, John really enjoyed that. And I was like, really? I would love to do a song with him sometime, get him on saxophone on a song. And then saw her later during OR and she was like, I asked John about playing sax and he was all for it. He said, yeah, he'd love to do a song with you sometime. And obviously, he died shortly after and I never got to do that. But I did find a sample of him on sax that I used to write a tribute song about him. So
that's cool.
Super, super interesting interaction with this like legend. And I don't normally get nervous when I see people, but as soon as I saw him, I was like,
but it's John Bachar. Yeah. Like, oh God. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you ever meet John? I assume.
Yeah, I did. I met him sort of briefly also, like you sort of shortly before he died. Actually, he was repping a Copa, the shoes at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was basically like right before I sort of got sponsored and sort of, became slowly eased into becoming a professional climber. But anyway, I think he hooked me up with some Copa shoes, which I still kind of remember the funny colors. And I was like, oh, these are neat. And, so I talked to him like a couple times and got some free shoes and it was kind of like, but I never, at that point I hadn't done that much and I was shy and he was such a big deal. Like I never really got to talk to him that much.
Yeah. Maybe
I
more
do remember meeting
stressful.
him,
Maybe more stressful than meeting these guys. Do you remember the first time you like stepped up to a route that you were sort of measuring yourself against your heroes on? Has that happened to you?
Dude, for me, that's happened a ton because in Yosemite, in particularly Peter Croft and John Bachar, I mean, they basically wrote the history of big wall climbing and free soloing in Yosemite. And I very intentionally tried to meet or exceed their performance on every route. It's like I've literally gone through almost everything that either of them has ever done in Yosemite and sort of intentionally sought it out. I mean, ranging from John Bachar, the first 5'11" free solo in Yosemite. What's that called?
Down at Butterballs or one of those?
No. Though I
New
did that
Dimensions.
as well. Yeah, New Dimensions. At Arch Rock. So like I intentionally on-site soloed New Dimensions once upon a time because I was kind of like, oh, it's the first 5'11" in the valley. It's like I should sort of pay tribute to it. And then the same with like Butterballs or the Nabisco Wall. I mean, that was like a Peter Croft sort of like legendary solo. I basically sold that specifically because like it never really appealed to me other than the history of it, the fact that Peter had done it and it was super important. But like I didn't climb with the cookie that much, and you look at that thing and you're just kind of like, is that cool? Compared to soloing Astroman or the Rostrum, you're like, who cares about the Nabisco Wall? But you're kind of like, it's historic. Peter did it. I should do it. So I mean, I've gone through Yosemite, and then the same with like Moratorium. I mean, there's the legendary story of John Bachar almost dying on-site solo in the Moratorium. And I never had what it took to on-site solo Moratorium because I didn't even on-site the route to begin with. When I climbed it with a rope the first time, I fell twice. So I mean, obviously I couldn't on-site solo it, but years later, I did actually solo it specifically to sort of pay homage to John Bachar.
Yeah. When you get to that spot where at least to the pitch, I feel like in the description, they describe the spot pretty well, but maybe I'm getting that wrong. When you get to that zone where Bachar
almost died,
got scared, and what's going through your head?
Well, so I'd gone up there with a partner and I'd tick the holds and I'd memorize the perfect sequence, and it's just like really
Yeah.
thin lie backing. And so you can totally imagine John Backer up there onside soloing just tips lie backing. It's so hard and it's so slick, and it's
Oh
a
my
very sandbagged
gosh.
11B. But when I soloed it, I had much more of a plan. I'd already climbed the route probably like 4 or 5 times over the years. I'd specifically worked it for the solo, and so it's a
Yeah.
totally different experience than what John had. And yet still I was like, oh my God, it's so slick. And it's so, I was like, oh, it'd be so scary. I mean, the difference also, I forget which year I did that, but I was probably wearing TC Pros and he was probably wearing EBs. It's like rigid shoes with no sticky
For
rubber. And you're just
sure.
kind of
Yeah.
like, it's just a totally different world.
Yeah, absolutely. You said you'd sort of, very systematically worked through what those guys did. Did you put a physical list together? Are you someone who makes those kinds of lists?
Yeah.
Like, here's what I'm going to do and in the order I'm going to do it?
Yeah, I've always had tons of lists of things that I'm interested in. I mean, I still have a list of things to solo in Yosemite that I just haven't gotten to, or just haven't, never quite done. Like actually, for example, like the Fish Crack is a very
Mm,
famous Peter Croft solo that he did, a bit, and there are like cool pictures of him on it. Uh, I've never sold that, and I've always kind of felt like I should just to be cool like Peter. But then,
yeah.
but it's not available in the springtime because the river's too big. You can't get to it. And then I don't know. The last several years, it just hasn't felt like worth going down there to like work on it and drag the family down to this like random zone down valley to try to top rope one route. I'm just kind of like whatever. But yeah, I still have a total list of routes like that I feel like I ought to do eventually.
Yeah, that's interesting that you go so deep into like if we're talking like musicians, these are like the album cuts. They're not the big singles. They're not the things
Mhm.
that, really get all the press, but
But the thing is,
like
I always have felt like you can't do the big things without also doing the little things.
right,
You know what I mean?
right.
It's like you don't solo Astroman without having done a bunch of other things first. Just because otherwise it's so scary. It's so big. It's so hard. It's like and you certainly don't solo El Cap without having done tons of things like these
Right.
other, like the Nabisco wall or whatever else. And
Yep.
so to me it always just felt like it's part of the process. Like you just have to do all the things that the people who have come before you have done. And I know
Yeah.
that other people could probably do it differently. Like you don't have to do it that way. But for me it seemed like an important part of the process.
Yeah. Well, I think Peter did, and correct me if I'm wrong, you may know. I think Peter did Astroman, and then very shortly after did Astroman and the Rostrum in a day. Is that right?
I'm not sure, but I know that he did both. I think he did both several times, and
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I know he did them separately and then did them together. I don't know.
And I know
I
that
mean,
was a big moment in soloing history, was like Peter doing Astroman, and then he just ups the ante
I
by
think he did
doing that
the.
plus the
I think
Rostrum.
he. I think he did the Nabisco wall that day as well, which
Oh,
is one of
yeah.
those things that's like
Wild.
nobody cares about anymore. But I think for him, he's just like he's flowing, he's doing well. It's like what's another 3 pitches of 511? He's like whatever.
Yeah. Was Astroman like one of those seminal moments for you? Because I know it was a seminal moment in climbing history when Peter soloed it. So I'm just curious for you what it was like soloing that.
I don't know. I soloed Astroman and the Rostrum together the first time. I did Astroman first and the Rostrum afterward, uh, and I don't. Yeah, I mean, it represented a big first step for me in that they were the first like big free solos that I did, and sort of the first hard, quote unquote hard free solos. In a way, though, I mean, they weren't that hard for me at the time. I'd climbed both routes and I felt
Right.
confident, and the climbs went well, and everything was good. There wasn't anything dramatic about it. I mean, they're both pretty secure routes if you know how to do them and you have the fitness for it. So to me, they sort of represented more like a first step where you're like, okay, now I'm like really, kind of playing with the big boys or whatever. Like now I'm actually doing big routes as opposed to just sort of like playing around. Um,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, I mean, it was kind of like because I've always felt like that was kind of the bar that Peter had left from the 1980s, and nobody else had really approached that bar since then. And so for
Mhm.
me, it was just like, okay, I've now done these routes. It's time to like look for the next things.
What do you think was your next, like the step you were leading toward in terms of raising the bar that first time? Would it have
What do you
been
mean?
Moonlight?
Yeah, so I did Moonlight a couple months after that, and then I did Half Dome a couple months after that. And so,
Right.
So basically, those two were sort of my first foray into big wall free soling, and then they sort of opened the door where I was like, oh, I can do this if I want to, and then within the next year, I'd done Moonlight and then Half Dome.
Yeah, when I was doing some research, I was looking at the sort of the timeline of like Bachar does the FA of Astroman, then Croft solos Astroman. Croft does the FA of Moonlight Buttress, then you come along and solo Moonlight Buttress. I thought that was a really interesting just link between the three of you with these like seminal routes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never really thought about that, but yeah, you're totally right. But that's kind of climbing progression, is to climb a route and then to free climb a route and then to free solo a route.
Yeah. Have you, I know in the film, in Free Solo, there's a moment where Peter seems concerned, have you all discussed that further, or was that just like the moment and you left it there?
Yeah, I don't know if we've talked about filming and soling a fair amount over the years. I would consider Peter a friend now, and I try to see him whenever he lives in Bishop, California. So whenever I'm around, I try to see him or climb with him a day or something. And I've had dinner with he and his wife several times and things, and we certainly talked about that. I mean, we have slightly different approaches. I mean, obviously Peter's more old school than I am, which is not surprising. Totally different generation.
Totally.
But he also just personally had some worse experiences filming free soling. And I think for him, there was less of an upside in his time. Like, there was no real reason to film stuff because there was less of an industry. Like, it didn't really matter for being a professional climber. Whereas for me, I can support myself as a climber by going out and filming on things occasionally. And so it makes it kind of a no-brainer where I'm like, oh, well, obviously I should film a couple solos every now and again because it allows me to climb full time. And I love going climbing. So I'm kind of like, oh, that's awesome. But for Peter, I think the calculus was a little bit different, and he had a couple bad experiences, and he was just always a little bit more reluctant to film or to share his soling. And so I think we just come at it a little bit differently.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And, I know you've talked about soloing ad nauseum, so I don't want to go too deep into that. But I do want to get into this like big wall link up speed type ascents that, that this episode is about. And it's really, other than doing the nose in a day, I think this was the next big explosion on the climbing scene, was Bachar and Croft teaming up to do El Cap and Half Dome in a day. And I've heard Peter talk about this a number of times, actually, where he says he sort of felt like there was this like finger of God coming down from the sky and choosing him, when Bachar asked him to do this. And when I was coming up as a climber, I did a lot of like, my partner and I would think of ourselves as like, we're like Bachar and Calc, or we're like Piana and Skinner trying to, pioneer these things or whatever. Did you ever engage in any of that? Like thinking about yourself as Croft or Bachar or whoever?
I never thought of myself as Croft or Bachar, but I did think a lot about what they had done. And, and actually, no, I occasionally, even still, I'll be like, I'm going to climb fast and aggressive like Adam Ondra, like I am Adam, things like that. Or like, like I am Chris Sharma. I just never quite styled myself as one of like my older heroes, like Peter or John Bachar. But no, occasionally I certainly think of other climbers and then try to emulate them in whatever way. I'm like, I try to like climb smoothly like Ron Calc, it's like beautiful footwork. But
man, the first time I climbed with Calc was in Vitavu, and in my head, he was like this super slow, sloth-like, extra smooth climber. And the smooth was totally correct, but he was like lightning fast movements and never second guessing anything. And I was just like, wow, that's mastery watching that guy.
Yeah, he's a good freaking climber. Even now, as sort of like a middle-aged man, like you see him top rope every once in a while and you're like, God, he moves so nicely.
Yeah, it's very cool. I sort of see the Bachar and Croft team as like the you and Tommy team of the past, or you and Tommy are the the next generation of this like super team that can get these things done.
That's kind of an interesting analogy in that in both cases, there's somebody who sort of represents a previous generation as well. I mean, like in a way,
Yeah.
they're both contemporaries. They climbed together, good friends.
Mm-hmm.
But, Tommy was my hero when I was a kid.
Right.
And it's much the same for Peter and John Bachar, where it's like,
Yeah.
now looking back at it, you kind of lump them into the same generation. But at the time, I think Peter very much considered himself, coming after John and being inspired by John. And I mean, he did come after John because Peter did more in the 80s and John did a lot more in the 70s.
Yeah. So Tommy's like your finger of God coming out of the sky to touch you?
I mean, kind of, and actually that's an interesting comparison because, Tommy and I did the free triple. And I mean, it's interesting
Mm-hmm.
that El Cap was climbed in a day in the 70s. El Cap and Half Dome were climbed together in the 80s. Dean Potter and Timmy O'Neill climbed 3 walls in a day in the early 2000s, not free. And then Tommy and I freed them in a day. It's like basically every decade there's kind of this next step in terms of adding an extra wall or free climbing an extra wall.
Yeah. And the third of that is Mount Watkins. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. With the speed game, I suspect when Bachar and Croft were doing it, it was in some ways, I guess it was probably safer when the way they were doing it, the methods they were using. But I wonder if it was actually safer. I'm just curious about how you feel about the like speed record versus safety aspect of doing these big things as fast as possible.
Well, so first off, I'm sure that neither of them would characterize what they did as speed climbing. I'm sure that they just considered it trying to climb both walls in a day. And
yeah,
so
that's a good point.
So they did have to employ, what we now call speed tactics in order to have enough time in the day to climb both walls. But for sure, neither of them thought of themselves as speed climbers. They were just climbers who were trying to get up 2 walls in one day.
Right.
And so, I mean, and I know what you're saying about safety. I would suspect that what they were doing is probably actually fairly similar to somebody doing the double nowadays. I'm sure they were simul climbing bits, and they wouldn't have had any progress capture devices. So like if the second fell, would have pulled them both off. But they had gear. I mean, it's like their rope, their rack, all their stuff is heavier. Everything's a little bit slower. The strategies are different. Actually, one of the big differences I think between them doing this in the 80s versus doing it now is that there would have been way fewer bolted anchors and way fewer bolts in general, and just like less fixed gear. Actually, maybe as much fixed gear because there'd be a lot more pitons, but way fewer like nice bolted anchors with chains on them, And so that kind of thing makes a difference because even in the what is it? I guess 15 years that I've been climbing on El Cap now. Like El Cap has sprouted all kinds of more anchor bolts and sort of convenience bolts and like rappel lines and things like that. And it just makes it feel safer and more chill and, more accessible. And so when they did the double, it would have felt way more alpine on both walls.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that at all. That's a really good point, that what they were doing was much more in a primitive time.
Would have felt way more adventurous. Like, there are fewer people. There's like worse trails. You know what I mean? There wouldn't have been fixed lines down the east ledges in the same way. Like it wouldn't be quite as easy to just like run down the top. I mean, and also when they did that, it wasn't even routine to climb El Cap in a day. And so it's not like people were commuting to and from the summit of El Cap all the time. So like the whole thing would have just felt way more adventurous.
Yeah. Well, you just mentioned like less people. And I remember Peter talking about like he's leading and he's like coming up to a ledge and there's a party and they didn't want to let him pass because they didn't know who he was. And then when they see Bachar coming up, they're like, oh yeah, go ahead, go past. It's like we part the way for John Bachar. I have to imagine that's a benefit for you and Tommy as well, is that people are like, we're going to let you go.
Yeah, that was a funny aspect of sort of like the race on the speed record for the nose for Brad Gobright and Jim versus me and Tommy, because nobody knows Brad or Jim by sight. And so people are always like, no, you guys can't pass. But they're doing the route in, 2 hours and 15 minutes or whatever it was, 2:20 or whatever they did. And you're like, come on. It's like, yeah, it's just funny. Yeah, I have a lot of friends who have experienced that, where it's like, or if I'm simuling on El Cap with a friend of mine who's just like some random good climber, and they go through people. Yeah, I've definitely experienced that a lot.
Yeah, that's funny. I hadn't thought about that at all. Definitely the fame and the the knowing the face goes a long way toward parting the ways on those crowded walls.
So that stuff is funny though, because it kind of doesn't matter if a party wants to let you pass or not. If you're climbing the nose in a couple hours, you're passing. It's just like they just don't like. They probably never even saw you coming, and they'll never see you go. And you're just like, whatever. You guys are spending 4 days on the wall. We're going to spend a couple hours. Just chill. Like, chill for 10 minutes. We'll be gone. Like, it's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no question. Do you think there's any danger? Were you in ever any danger? I'm curious of like over romanticizing the ascents of your heroes. Like I see a lot of people get stuck in this like, oh, I can't even try that yet. I'm not good enough because this person did it and they were a superhero.
No, I don't know. To me, the Yosemite progression always felt like a clear path where it's like, okay, first you just try to climb El Cap, and then you try to free climb El Cap, and then you speed climb, and then you do the Linkups, you do the double, you do the triple. I mean, in a way, maybe it's because I came into Yosemite later. And so there was already this long lineage where it's like, here's the history of what people have done. Here's the order in which they did it. Here's how they did it. And so there was a pretty clear roadmap for me in terms of how to learn to big wall climb. And so really you just have to go try. It's like you basically keep taking small steps and you keep climbing slightly bigger walls and faster style and whatever else. And then, and eventually you kind of reach the current standards, and then you're like, okay, well, the next steps are both sort of obvious and then sort of inobvious, like doing the triple or the free triple or the solo triple, all those kinds of things. You're like, on the one hand, they're really obvious, but on the other hand, you're like, oh, they're like not that easy to do. It's like, I don't know. Or like, I think was maybe the first to climb El Cap 3 times in a day via like real El Cap routes. Like Hans Florian and Steve Schneider had done it using the West Face, which isn't like whatever. But at the time, they had sort of had the vision of climbing El Cap 3 times in a day. And then Sean Leary and I kind of did it first, I think. But things like that, you're like, oh, it's an obvious thing to do, but I don't know, it takes a little creativity and everything to actually pull it off.
Yeah, for sure. As you were saying that, it made me think that maybe the people most in danger of sort of over romanticizing and using that like history to hold them back instead of to progress are the people who aren't quite entrenched in that scene. Because I think once you're entrenched in the scene, you get to see the path a little more clearly than when you're on the outside with these, huge stories kind of looming in front of the clear path,
I know. I think I personally was always more inspired by those big stories because they give you something, they're almost like a guidepost or something, where you're like, oh, that's a cool thing to aim for. Yeah. And then there's always an obvious progression of things to do to get there. You're like, okay, well, here's how I build up to that. And, it's cool to have that inspiration.
Yeah, I agree. That's the way I prefer to use history. That's sort of the purpose of this podcast, I think, is to help people be inspired by it.
No, I mean, I personally, like the iconic photo of John Long, Blue West Bay, and Jim Bridwell in front of the nose after climbing the nose in a day. You're like, that's so cool. It's like things like that. Like that's a big part of the inspiration to climb El Cap in a day the first time. And like there's an iconic photo of Peter Croft soloing the rostrum in his white painter pants, like up at the top. Yeah, he's like stemming out like near the top of the wall. Actually, and that picture was taken by John Backer randomly.
Oh, really? Fact.
Yeah. Yeah, so I heard Peter once say that, and I was like, "Oh, that's so funny." But things like that, like those photos, like that's cool. Like that was my inspiration for so long, and yeah, it gave me something to aspire to.
Yeah, that's interesting. You said John took that photo because he was also on El Cap taking photos of Lynn after she did the first free ascent of the nose. Like he went up with her afterward to take photos, and we don't think of John necessarily as a photographer, like he's kind of doing his own solo thing all the time, but really he's up there, documenting the history as well as making it, being a part of it.
Yeah, in a way though, I think you don't want to overthink it too much. You're just like, well, he's one of the few people who can easily get to those places, and he's friends with all the folks, and he's just like, my buddy's doing this cool thing, I should go snap some pics. It's like, it's not a dissimilar attitude to what we have now, where you're like, oh, my friend's doing something, I should go take a picture. Like, that's cool.
Yeah, for sure.
But do you I'm pretty sure I've heard Peter say this before, but I remember him telling some story about how John sort of thanked him after he soloed Astroman the first time, because John Backer was like, "Oh, I'm glad I don't have to do that," because it'd been kind of this obvious standing project of like, well, somebody's going to free solo Astroman, and it was sort of expected that John would, because it was his route, like he had freed it. But I think he just never quite had it / wanted to, so it just wasn't for him. And so when Peter finally did it, John Backer was like, "Oh, I'm so glad you did that because it takes the pressure off." Now it's like, okay, it's been done and it's your thing, and that's great.
Yeah.
I forget. I'm pretty sure I heard that from Peter, but maybe I heard on.
I'll have to ask him about that. Yeah, that's interesting. And it strikes me that Peter probably wasn't the type to feel the pressure as much. So when there's something like Moonlight Buttress, actually, I don't even think people thought of Moonlight Buttress as a potential solo.
Yeah, I don't think it was on the radar.
Until you
really.
did it. Like, I certainly never heard anything like, who's going to be the first to solo Moonlight Buttress,
Yeah,
Never
I mean,
heard
I think a lot of the solos that I've done over the years weren't really, there's not a huge competitive game for soloing. There aren't that many people lined up. I mean, I think with a couple of the Yosemite solos, I think Dean Potter had at least considered them. Like with Half Dome, I know that Dean had at least thought about it, but just had never quite decided to execute. And same with like the West Face of El Cap, he had thought about it, but never quite done it. But there aren't that many other solos there just aren't that many people who free solo big walls.
Yeah, totally.
Right. And then and Brad and I talked about it a bunch. Like Brad had considered some of the hard free solos as well. But like for Moonlight specifically, he was just too short to do a certain move off the rocker blocker. And he was like, there's no way I'm going up there and jumping off this ledge. He was just, so there are just a couple things that for him just represented a hard no. He's like, oh, I could do that except for this one move where I have to jump. And he's like, well, that's not happening. So, I mean, it's just kind of bad luck that he was, 5 inches shorter than me or something.
Yeah, totally. I'm sure you've heard the story that Peter tells of like Backer telling him, before the day that we do this, you have to just lay in your tent and all you can eat are saltines or whatever. I'm sure that's not a piece of the history that you followed. Am I right?
Well, yeah, no, I think the Peter story is that he had to take 2 rest days or something at a time, and he'd like never rested 2 days before or something crazy.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I experienced that a little bit where certainly in my first years in Yosemite, I mean, I just never really rested because even on your rest days, you would go out and solo easy routes because everything was new. And so it's like, I just wanted to literally climb everything in Yosemite. So no matter how tired you are, you're like, oh, there's that multi-pitch 5-6 I've never done. I may as well go tick something today and get a little light exercise.
Mm-hmm. What do these guys represent for you personally? Like, I want to talk about them in terms of, climbing history as well, but I'm curious for you, what do these two guys represent?
I mean, to me personally, John Backer and Peter Croft are two of the biggest inspirations in climbing. I mean, specifically around the things that they climbed, just because I'm inspired by all the same things that they were, like big granite walls and speed climbing and soloing and just the style in which they did them. I'm like, oh, it's just like, they're so cool. I mean, and then I don't know. And then as I've gotten older, I mean, Peter's been a big inspiration just in the way he's changed with the times, basically. It's like he was cutting edge in the 80s and he's still going climbing all the time and he's still putting up routes and he's having a great time sport climbing. And he's really like adapted to modern climbing and he has no problem with modern tactics and like perma draws and sport climbing and, whatever. It's like basically he just loves climbing and he's been doing it for like 50 years, maybe. I don't know. It's like he might be 60, maybe 40 something years. I mean, and he still just loves it and he's so happy about it. And he's doing it all the time. And I see that and I'm like, that's inspiring. Whereas in some ways, John Backer actually always made me a little bit sad in that I felt like he didn't change with the times. He was just a little too much of a traditionalist. And I was like, I look at that and I'm like, why not adapt? Like if the whole world is changing, change with it. It's like, yeah, because he was one of the best climbers in the country. It's too bad he just didn't decide to change with the times.
Yeah, I agree. I wrote the tribute song to him years and years ago, and the song is sort of about like the times were changing all around this guy, and he, for better or worse, he stuck to his guns, and in some way I have to respect that. But it's not for me. Like I definitely am someone who wants to change with the times and not become the old grumpy guy who complains about climbing every time I hear about it, But in some way, I appreciate that John really stuck to what he believed in.
I know I'm partially like, oh yeah, I respect that, but you're also like, if you believe in the wrong thing, maybe you should change your views.
Totally,
It's like
100%.
Kind of like, come on.
Yeah. Did you have posters on your wall as a kid? Like climbing posters?
No, I didn't really have posters. I cut out a few things out of magazines as I got older, and then, but mostly it was like at the climbing gym. I would see all the cool material, and my climbing gym had this little VHS carousel thing playing all the time, like little snippets of classic climbing films, like Masters of Stone 5, like playing on repeat on VHS in the retail shop. And so you'd see like climbing media all the time, and I was like, that's cool.
Yeah. I'm curious how, like, coming up in your era, how you ended up in the being more inspired by like Croft and Bachar as opposed to the sport climbing that was, really picking up steam and going pretty full bore by the time you were getting engaged in climbing.
Yeah, it's true that as I was growing up, I could have just as likely been inspired by Chris Sharma or Tommy or other people who were climbing at the cutting edge limit of difficulty at the time. But I think part of the reason that I was more inspired by Peter and John Bachar and such was just growing up in Northern California, being near Yosemite, being relatively near Joshua Tree. Basically growing up with stories of the Stone Masters, like. One of the first places I bouldered outside was Castle Rock outside of Santa Cruz. It's like a sandstone bouldering area, somewhere Chris Sharma also climbed a bunch when he was growing up. But there are all these problems like Yabo Roof and like Yabo Underclang, Yabo Cave, whatever. And like there are all these like Yabo problems. And you're sort of like, it felt like a direct connection to the Stone Masters, because Johnny Blonsky, like there are all these crazy stories of him like soloing things and falling into trees and like barely sticking this and that. And so I grew up sort of surrounded by all these crazy stories of like Stone Masters and Joshua Tree and them taking those skills and bringing them to Yosemite. And I just always thought that was cool. It's like, in some ways I identified more with that than I did with seeing Chris Sharma climbing the hardest moves ever done. You know what I mean? Like, and I was certainly inspired by seeing, Chris climbing Realization or whatever, but it's just not the same as sort of being surrounded by that climbing history. Plus, I think part of it is I just liked that style of climbing more. And realistically, I'm just not the best climber. I'm not Chris Sharma, but I do love the adventure and I love the big experiences. And that's kind of what the Stone Master ethos meant, like those big adventures.
Yeah. Did John Long's writing about the Stone Masters play into that for you?
Yeah, for sure. I read all of John Long's stuff at the time. What's his essay with the Greatest Blasphemy? Is that what it's called? With him going soloing, him going soloing with John Bachar and like barely sticking it, and then having a survival experience, then spending the rest of the day walking around looking at flowers in the desert. It's total incredible. Yeah, it's incredible. It's I think it's one of the best pieces of climbing writing ever. And and so I got to go and solo all those routes in Joshua Tree, like as I was growing up, and so that was all part of the progression of climbing for me. It's like I read these things, I knew all these stories. And so, I mean, I remember the first time I soloed left ski track on Intersection Rock. It's like the 11A that John Long almost falls to his death off of. And, when I went up to that, I was like, it had a big, it was like a larger than life route in my mind. I was like, this is a big deal. And, as it turns out, it's only 30 feet of hard climbing above sand. And, it's like, it's all pretty chill, like in the grand scheme of hard soloing. But, it meant a lot to me at the time.
Yeah. I remember climbing that for the first time on a rope and thinking about soloing it while I was climbing it. And, there's like,
did it make you climb worse?
It made me climb worse. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's like everyone has that experience. When you start imagining being up there without a rope, you're suddenly like, oh my God, it's like so much scarier.
Yeah, there's like one or two moves that are pretty hard.
Yeah, insecure.
And they definitely got in my head as I was like in the middle of them thinking about, oh God, what would it be like here without a rope,
Totally. Yes, such a great story though.
That's one of the things, like that story reminds me, it's one of the things I really admire about the way John approached things. I really like the competition part of sport, when I was a rapper, I really liked, battle raps. I love that aspect of things, sort of the like bravado of things. And John like posting that note on, in Camp 4 that's like $10,000 for anybody to follow me for a day. That kind of shit I just love.
That's funny. I'm like, I should post that. But you're like, that's so douchey. It's so douchey. Plus, it's like, would you want
would you
anybody
post
to try?
it on Facebook? Where would you post it?
Oh
you
my
can't
God.
just post it on the board anymore.
Yeah, you post it on the board. People see it on the board. They see it on the... Plus, that if you post something outrageous enough on the board, people will take a picture and post it online or share it more broadly.
Yeah, no question. Yeah.
Yeah, if you put like a big thing on the bulletin board in Camp 4, I think it would still make a splash.
Yeah. Speaking of the like growing with the times instead of, getting stuck in some era, do you lament the like old days of Yosemite? Do you like ever pine for those, or do you feel good about the progression of things? I know Yosemite's changing a lot with like wall permits and, things like that. So what's that feel like in your mind?
No, I don't know. I mean, yeah, Yosemite has changed a little bit, obviously, with more permits, slightly more rules, things like that. But realistically, the experience of climbing Yosemite has not really changed. And every time I drive into the valley, I'm like, these walls feel timeless. The climbs feel timeless. And even if the climbs change a little bit, where there are a few more bolts or there's like better protection and, there's more chalk, it's like things are just a little more popular, more buffed. I'm like, realistically, that kind of makes it more fun to climb a lot of the time. It's like there's less dirt in the crack and there are fewer ants biting you as you climb. And I'm kind of like, that's a good thing in my book. Like, I don't mind having some traffic on some of the routes. But no, I don't know. I mean, I think for me personally, the thing that I'm nostalgic about in Yosemite is the living alone in my van there, just because now it's like I have a family and a wife and more limited time. And so I can't just be in Yosemite for months, just kind of like waiting to see what I'm inspired by. And so I think I'm nostalgic for that part in my own life, where it's like, oh, it's just so open and free and chill. But realistically, I don't think the valley has really changed. It's like, yeah, they changed the traffic patterns, they changed the parking situation, they changed the permitting a little bit. But when you look at the walls, you're like, those are basically unchanging. It's like, except Half Dome being a notable exception, because the big piece that fell off Half Dome has like really changed the regular route and made it much worse. So sadly, it doesn't go free anymore, and it's like way less fun to climb.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you have that outlook on it. I've sort of the opinion that the rules and regulations can be a really good thing when they're done well, and make this a more pleasant experience for everybody. Whereas if it was the Wild West, it could just become a total shit show in a lot of these places. So I do think there's a lot of value in the rules and regulations, though, there's also overstepping. So, that's just my opinion.
In the case of climbing in Yosemite, though, I think that it's still very unregulated. It's like you really can still, like in the middle of the afternoon, you just be like, I want to go do a thing. And you just bike over, you solo route, you run down, you bike back, it's chill. So it's like, routes aren't that crowded and there's still just a ton of opportunity for adventure if you want it. So, I mean, and all the permitting, I mean, it's freaking free. All you have to do is just go fill out a piece of paper, and it has more to do with keeping track of how many people are using the park, which has as much to do with funding the park and, maintaining infrastructure and things, which I'm kind of like, that's all fine. It's like I use the bathrooms, like, I want them to know that I'm in the park so they can keep track of like how much TP they have to buy. You know what I mean? Like, totally. This is how you service the park.
Yeah. Well, I really love the climbers of today who talk about, who revere, who celebrate the history of how this place, this climbing community got to where it is, and how climbing got to where it is. So the people like Adam Ondra, who's always talking about the history, and Segrist, who loves the history, and I just had Bill Ramsey over to record a conversation about Alan Watts and Smith Rocks. Cool. And so I just appreciate how much of that goes on. And this podcast for me was like a continuation of John Long writing about the Stone Masters. I'm like, I want to tell some of the stories that never got told in the same like larger than life way that John Long told all those stories.
I was going to say, hopefully more truthfully and, more honestly, but if you're aiming for the same larger than life, then you're like, all right, I'll be like, and then Peter did the craziest thing.
Yeah. Well, the tagline of this whole show is a Todd Skinner quote, "Never let the truth get in the way of a good story." So,
totally.
I have to embellish now and then, and I'm not shy to say that I do that. So
That's fair.
Yeah, but so I appreciate what you do with climbing gold, and with, just the other night I Googled Alex Honnold, Peter Croft, and a Facebook post of yours from a long time ago came up that was just like, I loved this interview with Peter Croft, and he was my hero. And, I love that you're putting that stuff out there, especially with the platform and the position that you're in.
No, appreciate it. No, I mean, Peter's the man. It's like man, like last year I had a day I wanted to climb in Owens River Gorge, which is like his home area that he climbs like freaking 5 days a week there. Even on the days he's not climbing, he takes his dog on a walk there. It's like, it's crazy. He goes there like every day. And I wanted to climb, and he made a plan to like meet me in the morning. So basically there's some new development, and I was like, oh, there are new routes that I haven't done in the gorge. I'm going to go tick them all. I basically made a little itinerary through the whole North Gorge where I could like tick, all these different walls to do the new things. And Peter met up, and he thought the weather was going to be too bad. So he'd actually like blown himself out the day before, because he was like, oh, there's no chance we're going to be climbing. But then it turned out it was doable. And so he just supported for the day. He like didn't climb. He just hiked between all these different walls with me and chit chatted and belayed. And I was like, man, I've got Peter Croft as my personal belayer at like 5 different walls in one afternoon. I was so psyched. I was like, oh, it's amazing. And I was like, how cool is it that he's, I don't know, like late 50s or 60s or something, and he's just willing to come out on his rest day and just belay somebody at like 5 different crags, just to like tick all these random new obscurities. Like, oh, that's so cool. Like, he's just a real lifer. It's like he just loves climbing.
Yeah, I love to hear that. I love that he's still that much in love with it. The same as he obviously was back in the 80s.
Yeah. So. No, I mean, I felt bad just like dragging him around. Like, okay, here's another like new, 13A or 13B, some like random route that's like doesn't have draws and doesn't have chalk. Let's see how it goes. And he's like, cool, let's check it out. He's just into it.
Yeah, that's very cool. There was a moment a few years ago. Peter was a keynote speaker here at the Climbers Festival, and it was one of the years I was not emceeing the festival and the keynotes. And the MC at the keynote had these like games that he was playing to try to get people hyped, and he had Sam Leitner on stage with Peter Croft and handed Sam Leitner a pie and told Sam he had to smash it in Peter Croft's face. And Sam looked like he was just in terror standing up there. And finally, to get himself off of stage, he smashed the pie in his own face so that he could just walk off the stage and not have to do it.
Good for him. That is the honorable way to go. Because I'm like, there is no way I'd smash a pie on Peter Croft. That's like a no-win situation, and he found the only way, which is to sacrifice himself. Good for Sam.
I know. He made the right decision at the right moment, for sure.
That is, I would have felt the same. I would have been in terror. I'm like, there is no chance I'm going to smash a pie on Peter Croft. You're like, he's the Peter Croft. You're like, come on.
Yeah, the Peter Croft, exactly.
Yeah, it'd be like egging the Pope Backer or something. You're like, come on, like show some respect.
For sure. Well, man, thank you for this. I appreciate you taking some time and being willing to chat about these guys who I know meant a lot to you and certainly mean a lot to climbing.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure. I mean, I love all these stories, and yeah, they meant a lot to my climbing. So it's nice to keep sharing them.
Yeah. Quick question before we go here, Alex. I would love to hear your perspective on Todd and Paul doing the Salathe in 88 or 89, because I think that's the final episode in this coming season is Todd and Paul doing the Salathe. So I'm just curious your perspective on that.
Dude, I'm like, that's a whole different podcast. I'm so into that. I think it's amazing. I mean, so last year I tried to free the Salathe in a day in their style, like the way that it was originally done, via all their little variations, which on some of the pitches are actually like smaller. Like they did a different way to the hollow flake. They did, different things in different places. And for me, it represented sort of meaningful changes in the way that I freed the Salathe in the past. Like pitch 19, the harder, it's like a 13 seat corner. is much harder than the monster off with. But even like I never actually freed the Teflon corner before because I've always done the boulder problem because that's the way you would do it for soloing and for whatever else, and it's just simpler. But so I basically did their version of the Salathe free in a day, but I failed on the last move of the head wall, so I never actually did it. And I basically like blew myself up. I had like kind of elbow tendinitis, and then after I tried it, I was so terminally blasted that basically my elbow like blew up, and I couldn't try it again that season. So I was like sad, and so I haven't tried again. But I'd like to at some point. It's kind of like on my life list of like a cool thing to do. But I think about them all the time. I mean, so I did the Salathe solo record this season, rope soloing this season in the valley. Just like a short trip without the family. Just went for a week.
You like came out and smashed it in somebody's face who had just.
No, that's not even true. I just came out for a week and needed something to do. And actually, it was only because the things I wanted to do, my partners all bailed on me because. Like Sam Stroh, I was going to climb a route with him, but he was up on the Zodiac for like 14 days or something, and he did it, which is amazing. But my partner just never came down off the wall, so I never even saw him. So I was like, okay, well, I need to like get into rope soloing or like do something instead. Anyway, though, but I went up on the Salathe. Like basically every time I climb the Salathe, I think of the way it was when they did it, because now there's a bolted anchor at the base of the head wall, which makes it a little more normal for freeing the head wall. But when they freed it, it was a pin anchor at the base of the head wall. And I'm like, oh my God, it'd be so scary just hanging on a couple pins right at the base of the head wall and like whipping out of this groove, which like also has a bolt in it now and normally has fixed gear. But like, I don't know, being up there in the 80s free climbing is like so mega, because it's really different now just because there are enough bolts here and there and things are safer and more chill. I'm like, God, it would have been scary back then.
Yeah, we talked about Freerider last season. And I have a complicated like thought relationship with Alex Huber. Like I don't know the guy at all, but in doing a bunch of research for the 90s, he sort of came across as this bully in a lot of scenarios. So in my head, I was like, fuck this guy, And then I got to Freerider, and it was such a cultural shift in terms of, big wall free climbing and sort of opening it up to the masses that I just had to give him his flowers there. But I also wanted to dig into who did what pitches first that sort of led to Freerider happening. And it's such a cool history of the Salathe that spans so long, from
it's like 20-year history.
Yeah, from the very first ascent to then the Stone Masters like opening up the Free Blast, and then all these people coming in to sort of do these individual pitches, and then Todd and Paul finally seeing that vision through. I think is just really a really fascinating piece of Yosemite history.
Mm-hmm. No, there is an insane amount of history on the wall, on the Salathe and the Freerider and all the variations. I mean, and even like Mark Hudon and what's his name?
Right. Max Jones.
Yeah, Max Jones. The two of them doing freeze, and freeze can be in the 70s.
Yeah.
You're kind of like, man, like that would have been so bold back then too. It's like,
yeah, no doubt.
It's just, in a lot of ways, that's the style that is most relatable to modern climbers is, the freeze can be, because you just go up there, you do your best, and then you pull through all the parts that you can't do. And so I'm kind of like, that's basically how everybody climbs it nowadays. Except that realistically, they're probably free climbing less than Max and Mark did in the 1970s.
Yeah, and certainly not as a bold a fashion as they were doing it.
For sure. Yeah, they're doing it with like nuts and hexes and things. You're like, God, so scary.
Yeah, it makes me excited to go up there now. Like I had sort of written.
Have you never done the Freerider
climbing? No, I've done the Free Blast. I've never done the Freerider. So,
dude, you gotta do the Freerider.
I got excited about it doing that episode and talking to Josie McKee about it, and Chris Kalous came on to talk about it. And
classic.
So, yeah,
that's cool. No, you should do it. I mean, it's so good. Like it's such a good route.
Yeah, it looks amazing. How do you feel? Last thing here, and then I'll let you go. But how do you feel about the variations that cropped up? Not in terms of variation for themselves, because I think that's a really cool thing to have all these different ways that you can go. But the like Alex Huber coming and sort of making the claim of, I did the first true ascent of the Salathe, because those guys, used a hanging belay or whatever.
Well, I think his claim was that he was the first person to red point the whole route because he led every pitch, whereas they had swung leads, which was kind of the style of the time.
Right.
And, I was like, I get that. It's kind of splitting hairs, though. And it's like obviously a little bit douchey because if someone's doing the first ascent in the accepted style of the time, and then you show up and you do it in your accepted style of the modern time and somehow claim that it's better, you're like, yeah, it's fair. I mean, it is true that Alex Huber climbed every pitch, whereas they didn't. But you're also like, they didn't try to climb every pitch.
He did skip some of their pitches, particularly pitch 19. That's the one that I'm like, if you're going to skip the crux pitch, can you really claim the same route?
Yeah, though I find pitch 19 much easier than the head wall, and certainly easier to red point, just because it's like only hard at the top. Like the head wall is devastating if you fall off at the top because you're just completely blasted. It's like endurance.
Sure,
whereas pitch 19, you could fall off and you could come down. You could do it a couple times because it's like kind of easy to get up into the hard stuff at the top. And I don't know. I personally found pitch 19 like much easier to execute than the head wall. But I mean, it's still hard climbing, but it's like an easier kind of hard to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, but I think Alex Huber's point is just that he went from the bottom to the top, climbing the whole thing by himself. Like cool, but like leading the whole thing or whatever. And so, it's like if you take that for exactly what it is, then you're like, yeah, it's true. It's, power to him. But I don't think anybody who really knows Yosemite climbing history thinks of him as doing the first ascent of the Salathe. You're like, come on, like that's a total joke.
Yeah. So is your motivation for wanting to do it the way they did it purely just to follow the history?
I mean, honestly, a little bit, yeah. I mean, also I've been aspiring to do a new El Cap free route, or new for me, every year as a dad, and the Salathe like that is one of the lowest hanging fruits, because it's like I know it really well and it's like pretty easy to do, and it gets great shade in the spring, and so it's just like it's like low hanging fruit, which is why I tried to do it the one year, but then failed. So I did this other route on the west side, which is like barely an El Cap free route, but I kind of took it anyway because I was like, I don't know, we got a 2-year-old and I'm struggling, so I'll just take what I can get.
Yeah. Well, I have a 2-year-old right now as well, and I'm currently working to resurrect an old Paul Piana project, and I'm having my own little mini Salathe conversation on there because the way he bolted it is really, really cool, but there's an obvious way around his crux if I were to move a bolt, and I'm like fighting with myself. So I'm going to try to make it go the original way. Yeah, I
think you just got to think of what makes the better route overall.
Yeah. And I think his original way does make the better route.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. I mean, if that's the way, but if everybody else who subsequently climbs it is like in that crux looking over being like, why aren't we climbing the big jugs right there?
I know.
And kind of depending on how much the character of the difficulty changes, like if it makes it insanely hard to do it one way, whereas it keep it kind of consistent the other way, then you're like, I don't know.
Yeah. I thought about also bolting a variation that goes the other way, but leaving the original bolts as well, just for sake of, if you want to go the original way, go this way.
The Paul Piana experience.
Yeah, totally.
You got to call it the Paul Piana experience, PPE.
That's perfect, actually. I've been looking for a name for it, so maybe it is PPE.
That's what it.
Well, Alex, man, thank you for this. I appreciate it a ton.
No, my pleasure. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you create. Really, really lift Peter up a little bit.
Yeah,
and John. Oh, that's cool.
I'm gonna tell Peter's story in a way that he's probably not going to be comfortable with.
That's perfect.
It's going to be so big and loud.
He's easy to embarrass though because he's so humble.